He was a Russian by birth. He fled the motherland one step ahead of a Bolshevik firing squad. He designed and built the first four-engine airplane, the first airplane with an enclosed cockpit, and together with Charles Lindbergh, cooked up the seaplanes that made international airlines practical. Lindbergh called him the greatest aviation engineer he'd ever met.
He showed tremendous scientific talent at a very early age. By the time he was 11 or 12, he had read how to build small electrical motors, but he couldn't find any in Kiev at that time, so he actually began to take the bobbins from his mother's sewing machine and wrap them with wire, and he created his own electrical motors that he then powered with batteries by taking pickle jars and making batteries out of them.
For all his fixed-wing achievements, however, he is most closely identified with helicopters. For it was the helicopter company he founded relatively late in his life that turned his name into a household word. He is Igor Sikorsky, and he is a legend of air power. Igor Ivanovich Sikorsky was born May 25th, 1889 in Kiev, Russia. His father was a psychology professor and his mother a doctor, and together they nurtured their son's early interest in science.
His life was in a home in which he felt very sheltered, very secure, very happy, in a home in which his father encouraged scientific research and encouraged daydreaming. He read what today we call science fiction books, primarily Jules Verne. He loved Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, 80 Days Around the World, Voyage to the Moon. But primarily, there was one book, Robur the Conqueror, also known as, prophetically, The Clipper of the Clouds. And it's not too well known here in America, but it's a book that describes a flying machine very accurately, actually a helicopter. Very, very accurately described as a helicopter, some obviously 40, 50 years before it was ever flown.
He attended the Petrograd Naval College, but left in 1906 to study engineering in Paris, then the center of aviation in Europe. His time in France was a revelation. The Wright brothers were demonstrating their flyer outside Paris. The sky seemed filled with airships, and everywhere there were aeronauts and engineers collaborating on bigger and better flying machines. He returned to Russia and enrolled at the Mechanical Engineering College of the Kiev Polytechnical Institute.
He started pestering his parents to send him to Paris, because that was where the Wright brothers were flying, and that's where immediately after the Wright brothers' success, the Europeans tweaked their airplanes a little bit so as to pick up a little bit of the know-how that the Wrights had demonstrated, and flying exploded in France.
In 1909, armed with an engineering degree, he returned to Paris. He befriended the elite of aviation there and spent much of his time talking about his vision of an aircraft that could take off vertically, hover, move sideways, and set itself safely back down. The experienced pilots around him laughed at his plans. It was hard enough then getting an airplane to simply fly. Getting it to stand still without falling out of the air seemed laughable. Sikorsky announced to his doubting friends that he would return to Kiev and build a rotary wing aircraft, a helicopter. He bought two engines, 15 and 25 horsepower, and boarded a train east.
It's significant to me that his first aircraft and his second aircraft were both helicopters. They didn't fly. We know now that 15 and 25 horsepower is just too little to do it. But these were the first two aircraft he attempted. Very wisely, he then decided that he had to, in his words, temporarily postpone the helicopter.
He built a succession of small planes that clearly owe much of their inspiration to the Wright brothers. In only a few years, Sikorsky was one of the leading engineers in Russia. He was put in charge of the aviation subsidiary of the Baltic Railroad Car Works and went to work designing and building aircraft for the Tsar.
He was the first, actually, to come up with the idea of using multiple engines on an airplane. After he had one engine get caught with mosquitoes in the carburetor and the airplane went down, he realized that two engines are better than one.
A multi-engine airplane was a radical idea. Other engineers thought it impossible. If the weight of the engines didn't keep the plane on the ground, they believed the forces and vibration of more than one engine would tear the plane apart in the sky.
During his early years, he developed multiple engine aircraft, four-engine aircraft that were very, very large, which requires a great deal of skill as an engineer to be able to produce a large aircraft that everything works correctly, especially at the time of the type of materials they had to work with. It was quite an achievement.
Sikorsky continued on, however, and the result was a four-engine behemoth with an almost unfathomable 89-foot wingspan. Called simply the Grand, when it flew in 1913, it made Sikorsky into a Russian hero.
The Grand was a unique experiment in trying to convince the world that a large four-engine aircraft was possible. He wanted to build this airplane because he wanted to prove that an aircraft had to have two characteristics. The Grand was designed to demonstrate two critical elements. A, the element of being able to maintain altitude and continue flight if one engine failed on you. And the second, equally important element, that airplane had to be able to lose any one of its engines, inboard, outboard, any one side or the other, and remain controllable. He, with a twinkle in his eye, would talk about the Grand and say that it was a very unique aircraft. It took off at 65 kilometers an hour, it cruised at 65 kilometers an hour, and it stalled at 65 kilometers an hour. But other than that, it was a highly efficient airplane.
His next plane, the Ilya Muromets, was even bigger and became the main bomber of the Russian Imperial Air Force in World War I. Designing aircraft had made Sikorsky wealthy. He was invited to meet several times with the Tsar, and there was talk that he might be knighted for his work.
When the revolution started, that very fact that he had been recognized by the Tsar and had been rewarded by the Tsar made him an enemy of the working class and made him a target of the Soviet, or the Bolshevik at that time, hit squads.
A committed individualist, Sikorsky could not live under communism and decided to leave. His wife chose to stay and refused to let their daughter travel with him. He left penniless and broken-hearted, a refugee bound for Paris, but destined for the United States. After fleeing the Russian Revolution, Igor Sikorsky tried to find work in Paris.
The World War I was still on in 1917, and so he went to France, where the French aviation authorities knew him very well because that he had purchased during the war a large number of French as well as British engines for his four-engine bombers. They commissioned him to build a large bomber for them.
But when World War I ended, so did the French commitment to aviation. And with no other option, he sailed for the United States.
My father then spent some weeks studying the situation and then decided that he would go to the United States because he felt that this very, in his words, this very great and wonderful country was probably the only nation which would accept a penniless immigrant with the dream to start building airplanes again.
Though famous in his own country, he was unknown in the United States. He arrived in an unwelcome wave of refugees. There were no opportunities for him in aviation. With World War I ended, no one was building new aircraft. The glut of military surplus biplanes supplied the embryonic commercial aviation business with all the planes it could handle. With nothing else to do, Sikorsky tutored Russian immigrants on New York's Lower East Side. He lectured on math and astronomy and aviation. He lived in poverty, but never let it break his spirit. And as time passed, he built up a following in the large community of Russian refugees. His optimism seemed boundless, and his vision of the amazing future of flight made what were really little more than daydreams seem real.
For a lot of the Russian immigrants, he was something of a hero, something to aspire to, having come here as an immigrant and having all these dreams that he was so anxious to fulfill.
In the early 1920s, Sikorsky resigned himself to the fact that he would never again get to design and build aircraft. Then, in 1923, a group of Russian emigres approached Sikorsky. They had a small amount of money and were willing to work. Would Sikorsky do them the honor of helping them design and build an airplane? Sikorsky set up operations on a chicken farm next to Roosevelt Airport on Long Island. There, he and his small band of Russian immigrants went to work. There was never enough money for payroll and barely enough for materials. No matter, Sikorsky and his Russians worked through night after night on a large twin-engine airplane Sikorsky had designed. And then, with the plane partially built and a desperate need for high-powered engines to make it fly, Sikorsky and his Russians ran out of money. It seemed as if their dream of flight was going to die.
A gentleman drove up, stepped out of his chauffeur-driven limousine, walked around inspecting the airplane, which was being built in the open. The gentleman stopped, started a conversation with Igor Sikorsky, and Igor Sikorsky eventually tells the story that this gentleman sat down and wrote out a check for $5,000, handed it to my father and said, "I believe in you, I trust you, pay me back when you can, go, start building your airplanes." The man's name was Sergei Rachmaninoff, and it was this great pianist and composer who gave Dad his start in America.
The plane Rachmaninoff's contribution made possible was the S-29A, a twin-engine, all-metal transport that was the forerunner of the modern airliner.
It gave him the intellectual freedom and the financial wherewithal to produce the aircraft that a visionary could see, and in the process produce very successful aircraft.
He followed with other designs and started building a reputation as a visionary. In 1930, he gave a newspaper interview in which he described a glimmering future of sleek metal aircraft carrying hundreds of passengers from continent to continent.
Igor Sikorsky predicted in this newspaper interview that New York would be the center and the hub of one of the most busy airline services. Giant all-metal airplanes, sleek all-metal airplanes carrying hundreds of passengers would be taking off every hour on the hour for the far corners of the world.
At a time when most aircraft were still made of fabric stretched over a wooden frame, he talked about pressurized cabins and jet engines as if they were something he had already tested.
To get metaphysical, my father also believed very strongly in intuition, in a sixth sense, which sometimes came to you in a flash in the middle of the night. Sometimes it arrived very, very slowly after you'd been chewing on a problem for a while.
He had his first big hit with the S-38, a flying boat that Pan American Airways used to open new commercial aviation routes to Central and South America. That success brought in other investors, including United Aviation, which was then a major producer of aircraft. And for the first time since leaving Russia, Sikorsky had the money for large-scale design and construction of aircraft. Though still fascinated with helicopters, his business grew because of his success designing fixed-wing aircraft. Among those who visited the Sikorsky factory was Charles Lindbergh, just returned from his flight to Paris. Sikorsky and Lindbergh found in each other kindred spirits. They were both intellectually restless, at the same time cerebral and instinctive. Both had clear visions of aviation as an everyday experience, pioneers who longed to make their field of endeavor commonplace to the point of being boring. Even their differences seemed complementary. Lindbergh looked at aviation from the point of view of a pilot. He wanted to open the world to aviation, and he traveled ceaselessly, charting routes for others to follow. Sikorsky, on the other hand, saw aviation as an engineering problem. To follow the routes Lindbergh was plotting, a passenger plane would have to have a certain range, be able to reach a certain altitude, and carry a certain amount of fuel.
He'd spent a lot of time in the dark listening to music, thinking, and he felt that he could almost see into the future, so to speak. Again, he was a very mystical, very spiritual man, to see what the needs would be, where his ideas could be applied to the betterment of mankind. And I think his particular genius came in his ability to take technology and apply it to the human need.
Lindbergh, Sikorsky believed, was the greatest pilot in the world. Sikorsky, Lindbergh said, was the most gifted aircraft designer he had ever met.
Dad had a great deal of respect for Lindbergh because there's no doubt about it, man knew a great deal about aviation. And in fact, it was this gentle teamwork between Lindbergh and Sikorsky, the mutual respect that they had for each other, that was absolutely wonderful to see in action.
The first plane they collaborated on was the S-40, a flying boat larger and more dependable than any other. Lindbergh was working for Pan American Airways, setting up airmail service to the Caribbean, which was then a sea of islands without landing strips. Tying them together with aircraft posed problems that seemed even to Lindbergh nearly insoluble.
I was growing up at that time. I was a small kid, but I was privileged once in a while to sit in a corner of the dining room when these two giants would discuss the growth of aviation, the need for higher speeds, the inevitability of higher wing loadings, and yet the improvement of our knowledge of aerodynamics, which would still keep landing speeds down while the cruising speeds would go up. Now, it was a wonderful way to grow up because you may have gotten a formal education in high school and in college, but if you were an aviation buff, as I was, those evenings listening to Charles Lindbergh and Igor Sikorsky were the greatest aeronautical academy that anybody could dream of having.
It was the beginning of one of his most productive periods. Working together with Pan Am and Lindbergh, he designed a series of amphibious aircraft that formed the famed Pan Am Clipper fleet. He had in his career played a key role in two separate revolutions. In Russia, he had pioneered multi-engine aircraft, which became the first dependable air transports and long-range bombers. In the United States, he had designed the flying boats that had made intercontinental air travel possible. The Pan Am Clippers shrank the world, putting every place in the world within a couple of days' travel of every place else. So, with his company doing well and his reputation secure, he returned to his first love. In the middle 1930s, Igor Sikorsky dug out 30 years of notes and sketches, dusted off a handful of patents, and went to work on the helicopter. Before Igor Sikorsky got seriously into helicopter development, there had been a number of more or less successful experiments in vertical flight. Some could fly but not hover, and others couldn't fly at all. Overcoming the torque of a spinning main rotor and still being able to maneuver was such a big problem that it led many to believe that a practical helicopter would never be developed. Sikorsky, however, believed passionately that the helicopter would work.
He was not interested just in engineering and technology. The primary reason he developed with the helicopter was to rescue people, to save people's lives.
As he worked and reworked the design of his helicopter, Sikorsky said over and over that if a person was in danger, an airplane could fly over and throw flowers to him, but a helicopter could come in and perform a rescue. Working at his Stratford, Connecticut factory, he and his team, still made up largely of Russian immigrants, built the VS-300. Ungainly by modern standards, the 300 was little more than a framework to support the engine and rotor. On September 14th, 1939, Sikorsky sat down in the VS-300's pilot seat for its first flight.
When he climbed into this machine for the first time, he said it was a beautiful chance to relive one's life all over again, to design a new type of flying machine without quite knowing how to design it, build it without quite knowing how to build it, and then you climbed aboard and you opened up the throttle and you tried to teach yourself to fly at the same time that you were the test pilot in charge of the helicopter.
Sikorsky carefully, slowly lifted off, learning to fly the helicopter as it rose. He went only a few feet off the ground, hesitated a few seconds in midair, and settled gently back to Earth. The world had its first working, practical helicopter. While Sikorsky thought the helicopter's future lay in rescue, the first American military man to get a look at the VS-300 instantly recognized its battlefield potential.
People began to realize the idea that we can move large numbers of troops, we can attach weapons to these, and so the United States Army, for example, their aircraft, their helicopters, these are very, very important for maneuver of the Army units.
In 1942, while looking for aircraft that could be developed to fight German U-boats in the North Atlantic, two Coast Guard officers paid Sikorsky a visit. They watched in awe as Sikorsky lifted 25 feet off the ground, lifting a second man below on a suspended rope ladder. In their report on the test, they said Sikorsky's machine had many advantages over the blimps the Navy had developed for anti-submarine warfare. They recommended the Coast Guard buy 3 or 4 for testing, but the Navy balked at the $250,000 price tag. When the officers pointed out that helicopters could serve a search and rescue function, the War Department replied that the Navy was not interested in life-saving. They just wanted to get on with the business of killing the enemy.
I think he was aware that inevitably, sometime sooner or later, it would be used as a military instrument of war. But that he said, was not the fault of the helicopter, because for every single person that it killed, he insisted quite logically that it probably saved 100.
For the remainder of his life, Sikorsky designed and built helicopters. From the R-4, the first mass-produced helicopter, to the UH-60 Blackhawk, the machines he and his company designed and built rewrote the rules of aviation, of warfare, and of search and rescue.
Whenever one talks about Igor Sikorsky today, it is the helicopter that he is remembered as. And that's, I think, justifiably so. It is the last and, in many respects, the most important piece of equipment that my father invented and left for mankind. When I asked him about it, he said he had a number of favorite aircraft. And obviously the Grand, the first prototype 4-engine aircraft, was one. The flying boats were another one. But I believe also he himself felt proudest of his achievements in designing the helicopter.